Some rooms carry more than furniture. They carry memory, silence, and the kind of truth that smoulders long after the fire's out. Tonight's mystery unfolds in a brownstone where a dancer vanished, a hotel burned, and a ledger whispered secrets no one dared to read aloud. In this case, guilt isn't shouted, it's folded neatly in silk and poured quietly down the drain. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. I was doing what any self-respecting operative does at 11:43 on a Wednesday night, balancing a week's worth of expense vouchers that had been aggressively resisting order. The radiator hissed like it had a grievance, and the coffee in my cup had reached that bitter stage where the heat gives up, but the grounds stay behind to gloat. I was weighing whether I could fudge a cab ride into a client meeting that hadn't happened when the phone rang. I let it ring once more for drama. "Goodwin." "Arch," said Lon Cohen, sounding like his cigarette was winning. "Marston Hotel, room 408. Girl's dead. You might want to take a walk." I just had coffee. "She's still dead." He hung up without a goodbye, which was his version of a hug. I looked at the clock. Wolfe wouldn't stir until breakfast, and even then not for corpses without retainers. I reached for my coat, sighed like a man heading into weather, and left the brownstone smelling of ink, boredom, and the faintest trace of something that might become news. Room 408 at the Marston Hotel had that low hum of bad timing, a silence so deliberate it made sound feel like a trespass. The door had been propped open with a brass ice bucket, and someone in uniform had already taped up the threshold, like dignity was still possible. She was there, of course, Janelle Varney. I'd never met her before, but she had the look of someone who knew how to pose, even for death. Her dress was deep plum, tight across the hips, and slit in a way that suggested confidence rather than luck. One heel still clung to her right foot. The other had landed sideways near the bed, the ankle strap twisted like a shrug. She lay across the carpet as if someone had lowered her there gently, and then changed their mind. No blood, no violence, just stillness. A faint scratch on her throat, not deep enough to explain anything, no sign of forced entry, no perfume in the air, only the hotel's stale effort at lemon. I took in the room like I was rehearsing it for a jury. Wine glass on the balcony rail, lipstick ring perfect. A silk scarf looped twice and pulled taut around a chrome chair back. A single earring, silver, teardrop-shaped, resting in the bathroom sink as though it had tried to escape. It wasn't murder, not yet. It was just a question. One that had waited until she stopped answering. The name had floated around town like a jazz refrain, Janelle Varney. She wasn't famous, not really. But if you knew where to sit after midnight and had a fondness for women who smiled like they'd rid your wallet before your face, you'd heard of her. She danced at the Blue Orchid. Not the kind of dancing that went with feathers and floor shows, but the kind that made older men remember their knees and forget their wives. She didn't hustle, she suggested. There's a difference. Hustlers need your money. She made you think it was your idea. She wasn't beautiful, not in the magazine way, but her timing was exquisite. The way she moved, the pause before a laugh, the glance that skipped but never tripped. You could tell she'd measured every gesture before letting it go. She wasn't a girl who got murdered in a cheap hotel room, not unless something had gone off script. And judging by the look on her face, eyes wide, lips parted just enough to start a sentence she never finished, I'd bet the script had burned before she could turn the page. A room talks if you listen without needing answers right away. I walked it clockwise. The chair with the scarf was positioned awkwardly, too far from the desk, too close to the door, as if someone had dragged it mid-thought. The scarf was silk, pale gold with a red thread stitched along the hem. Not torn, not knotted, just pulled tight and left behind like punctuation. The wine glass on the balcony rail was crystal, not hotel issue. Whatever had been in it had evaporated into the warm October air, but the lipstick ring hadn't smudged. Whoever had poured it hadn't stayed long enough to sip. The bedspread was turned down, but the sheets were untouched, a careful disarray like a stage set left mid-rehearsal. The bathroom light was on, humming slightly. I stepped in and saw the earring in the sink, its match nowhere in sight. Silver, with a cracked opal. The kind of thing you wear when you want to be noticed, but not remembered. In the wastebasket, 2 receipts from the orchid, 1 cigarette stubbed out in lipstick, and a crumpled napkin with the word Tuesday scribbled in pencil. No handwriting on the hotel notepad, no fingerprints I was allowed to see, but plenty of things missing. Whoever came last hadn't come alone. I was just folding the napkin into my pocket when the sound of hard-souled justice rounded the corner. Kramer, Inspector Lionel, as fond of surprises as he was of ulcers. "Goodwin," he said, like it hurt. "I didn't see your name on the guest list." "That's because I arrived unescorted. You're not cleared." "I haven't touched a thing, just soaking in the ambiance." He looked at the scarf, the earring, the wine glass, then at me. "You've got a minute to leave, or I'll be clearing you with paperwork." We'd danced this step before, but I was out of rhythm and short on music. I nodded, held my hands up in a performance of surrender, and walked past him with the slow gait of someone who knew more than he should, and not enough to matter yet. Outside, the night felt colder, not because of the weather, because once Kramer showed up, it meant the story had already started writing itself, and we both knew how messy it would get before Wolfe would even turn a page. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, the orchids had gone dark and Wolfe's lamp was still on. He hadn't moved from the big chair, his bulk folded into its leather with the comfort of habit and stubbornness. A book lay open on his lap. The pages hadn't turned. I gave him the summary in even tones. Marston Hotel, room 408, Janelle Varney deceased. No blood, no struggle, but enough curiosities to keep the grave company. He didn't blink. "Who is she?" "A dancer, well-kept, blue orchid, one of those women who make men feel like gravity still loves them." "No fee?" "Not unless you count the eternal debt of Lon Cohen." "Pah!" He lifted a finger, as if dismissing the very concept of favors. "We are not an ambulance." "No, sir. We're just the men who get called when the siren stops." He closed the book and set it on the table beside him, careful to preserve his page with a silk ribbon. "If Miss Varney has no living employer, then she has no standing." "Not even if she died interesting?" He reached for the beer Fritz had left. "Especially not." I let the silence settle. There'd be no move from Wolfe tonight, not without money, menu disruption, or moral combustion. And this one, apparently, was merely dead. Fritz served breakfast at 8:59, and Wolfe was midway through his second poached egg when the doorbell rang. It was a clean chime, insistent but not panicked, the kind that meant tailored suits, not reporters. I opened the door at 9:01 precisely. The man standing there had skin like bleached linen and eyes that couldn't decide whether to be tired or dangerous. He held a hat in one hand and an envelope in the other. "My name is Raymond Ebert," he said. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Wolfe about a young woman named Janelle Varney." And just like that, the morning stopped being hypothetical. The man who entered the brownstone at 9:05 that morning was either fresh from a memorial or determined to look like his conscience wore spats. He had a frame like a tennis instructor gone soft and a face that had been rehearsed in boardrooms. His name, delivered with polished humility, was Raymond Ebert, president of Ebert Consolidated Textiles. He held his hat precisely, and his gloves more so. I showed him in, resisting the urge to guess how many mirrors he passed on the way. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk as always, and offered no gesture of welcome beyond a mildly displeased blink. "My concern," Ebert began, voice clipped, "is for the girl's reputation. Miss Varney, Janelle." Wolfe didn't respond. He simply stared, as if waiting for something more substantial than virtue. "I'd like her name cleared." Wolfe let out a sound like a page being turned without interest. I sat to the side, watching Ebert sweat slightly in spite of the October chill. He had the look of a man who had come here to purchase absolution, but hadn't yet settled on a price. Wolfe said nothing, not yet. Ebert's speech was well-ordered, but so are funeral hymns. Wolfe allowed him 3 minutes of vague concern, then closed his eyes. I coughed politely. Nothing. Then Ebert reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. I've seen a lot of envelopes. This one had that expensive crackle, the kind that says it's never held a bill overdue or a love letter meant. He placed it on Wolfe's desk as if making an offering to an indifferent deity. Wolfe opened one eye, then the envelope. Inside, $5,000 in clean hundreds, stacked like promises. Wolfe said finally. Your concern, Mr. Ebert, has acquired definition. Ebert nodded, relieved. I didn't blame him. Wolfe had that effect, making you feel like you'd auditioned and weren't sure if you'd gotten the part. I expect discretion, Ebert said. Wolfe didn't answer. But his fingers had already drifted toward the nearest notepad, and I knew that meant the wheels, slow and arrogant, had started to turn. Wolfe began with the obvious. When did you last see Miss Varney? Ebert shifted in his chair. It was the first movement that wasn't calculated. It's been some weeks, perhaps longer. We parted on good terms. I watched his hands. They were smooth, too smooth for a man who claimed to care about a dead woman. They moved a little too much, straightening the cuff, realigning the envelope, brushing invisible dust from the desk's edge. I kept her apartment at the Marston, he added quickly. There was no obligation. She needed a place. I paid, that was all. Generous? I said. Wolfe gave me a glance, not sharp enough to slice, but enough to signal I'd made my point. Ebert's mouth twitched. I'm not here to defend sentiment, only to see that she's not spoken of like some common... She is dead, Wolfe said. The living will shape the narrative. Your money ensures that my efforts lean toward your preferred version. Ebert nodded once, the way some men sign checks, with intent but no affection. The room went still again. Wolfe picked up the envelope, case open. The file was thin, but the air around it wasn't. Wolfe gestured for me to begin the legwork. Janelle Varney had not been lonely in her final days. Aside from Ebert, there were 2 other notables in her orbit. First, Peter Hollis, a high-tier defense attorney with a fondness for antique cufflinks and inconvenient women. He had a record, not with the police, but in court filings, divorce settlements, and the columns that don't print full names but leave enough to guess. Second, Mickey Julian, a jazz pianist of intermittent promise and constant misfortune, the sort of man who plays like an angel and drinks like someone trying to forget heaven. Wolfe jotted their names with the care of someone indexing poisons. Would either of them kill her? I asked. No, Wolfe said, not yet. Meaning? Men kill women like Miss Varney not for love, but for leverage. One must determine what was being leveraged and by whom. I knew that tone. It meant Wolfe was hooked, however distantly. A woman like Janelle Varney didn't die without trailing debts, financial, emotional, possibly fatal. The Blue Orchid Lounge lived up to its name. It was dim, fragrant, and slightly bruised. The maitre d' wore a tuxedo with desperation at the seams and showed me to the bar like I'd brought both a reservation and a conscience. I knew the type of place. The women knew the difference between flirtation and transaction, and the customers pretended they didn't. I asked about Janelle. Most clammed up fast, as if speaking her name out loud might summon a subpoena or a memory they'd rather forget. One dancer, tall and lacquered, said, she kept to herself. Except when she didn't. Meaning, she had a room here, but her real address was secrecy. Another girl added she'd leave with men who didn't come in through the front. When I asked about fights, jealousy, threats, anything, they just blinked. Not out of fear, out of practice. In a place like the Orchid, emotions get worn down to essentials. I dropped a tip the size of decency and got one last answer. Janelle had been crying 2 nights ago. Not the kind of tears that beg for rescue. The kind that no rescue costs more than you've got. I left with smoke in my jacket and silence in my notebook, but I knew I'd be back. The Marston's night doorman looked like the kind of man who remembered tips better than faces. Still, when I asked if he'd seen anything strange the night Janelle died, he gave me a pause worth noting. There was a man, he said finally, came in late. Didn't go to the desk, used a key, had an umbrella. Was it raining? He blinked. Number, that's why I remembered. Room number? He hesitated, then muttered. 408. I leaned in. You write that down? He looked offended. I remember, I don't write things like that. Which meant he was either careful or had something to hide. Describe him. Tall, overcoat, looked like a lawyer or a politician. Clean shoes, bad posture. That narrowed it down to half of Midtown. I thanked him, meaning it halfway, and walked off slowly. A man carrying an umbrella on a dry night either expected rain or needed a reason not to be recognized. And I had a feeling Wolfe would be interested in both options. Finding Mickey Dulain wasn't hard. He was playing a late set in a basement club in the East 40s, fingers loose, eyes red, voice gone. I waited until the set ended and tapped his shoulder. He flinched like I'd offered him a tax form. I just want to talk, I said. She's dead, he muttered. What's there to talk about? Who knew she'd be? That made him bolt. Not run, just move fast enough toward the back that I had to follow. I caught him by the alley door. She called me, he said. That night, 10:30, crying. Said someone found out? Found out what? He shook his head. She said one word, Switzerland. Then the line went dead. Did she mention a name? Number, just that it was bad. Real bad. Dulain's face was a portrait of fear framed in failure. I let him go. Chasing men who already regret their lives isn't sporting. I returned to the brownstone with a word Wolfe would like and a story that didn't yet fit the page, but it was starting to. It took a piano bench, a gin and bitters, and the quiet promise of anonymity to get Mickey Dulain to talk. Even then, it came out like a note too sharp, unexpected and uneasy. She called me, he said, eyes not meeting mine. Janelle, the night she died, 10:30, give or take. I let the pause stretch. When he didn't continue, I gave him my full attention and no expression. She was crying, real crying, not staged tears. Said someone new. Who? I asked. He shook his head. Didn't say, just... She said he knows. He knows about Switzerland. And then? The line went dead. Not disconnected, not ended, dead. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Sometimes people can't say more because they're afraid, and sometimes it's because they've already said too much. Either way, Dulain was now as much a part of this as Janelle's scarf and the forgotten glass on the balcony rail. Back at the brownstone, I relayed it to Wolfe in measured tones. When I said Switzerland, he raised one brow 1/2 centimetre, which by his standards is a thunderclap. Indeed, he murmured, a curious place for a dancer to lose her balance. Wolfe did not believe in coincidences. He believed in causality dressed in misdirection, and geography was no exception. When I confirmed that Janelle Varney had spent 2 weeks in Zurich the previous year, he closed his eyes not out of fatigue, but to reduce the sensory noise. Zurich, he repeated, not Paris, not Rome, Zurich, a city where silk is less admired than discretion. Maybe she went to ski, I offered. Wolfe opened one eye. Miss Varney strikes me as a woman who preferred champagne to frostbite, and had little use for altitude unless it improved her view of the man paying. He had a point. Zurich was bankers, lawyers, coded ledgers, and a very polished way of keeping the past unspoken. The source of the trip's funding? Unknown. The purpose? Opaque. The timing? Suspicious. And Janelle, dead in a Manhattan hotel room with one heel off and her makeup intact, had cried about it just hours before the curtain closed. Wolfe leaned back, the upholstery sighing under his bulk. We must know not why she went to Switzerland, but what she returned with. Peter Hollis welcomed me into his office the way a host welcomes an IRS audit, with courtesy that tried too hard. He wore the kind of suit that makes statements and the kind of smile that dodges questions. "I haven't seen Janelle in months," he said. "Charming girl, very independent." "Sure," I said. "So independent she let men like Ebert pay her rent." Hollis chuckled as if I'd told a joke about someone else's funeral. "I suppose she had admirers. I wasn't one of them, not anymore." He said it too quickly, too cleanly. "Any contact recently?" "None." His eyes flicked sideways just before he said it, a tell I could have read in the dark, the kind of lie people tell when they've rehearsed it twice and expect a gold star. "She ever mentioned Switzerland?" He hesitated a breath too long, then smiled again. "Switzerland's lovely. Never been." I nodded and left without more. Not because I believed him, but because I knew Wolfe wouldn't need more than the tone, the pause and the pressure behind the lie. Hollis had left a fingerprint, not on glass, but on the truth. Wolfe would see it. He always did. The Marston Hotel didn't have a reputation for discretion, but it did have security cameras, one modern concession to the modern sins it hosted. I bribed the night manager with a smile and a pair of Nick's tickets that had Wolfe's unknowing blessing and got access to the surveillance logs. Peter Hollis had said he hadn't seen Janelle in months. At 9:42 p.m., the footage showed a man entering through the service door, hat low, collar up, gait deliberate. But the camera, unforgiving as always, caught the cheekbone, the profile, the cufflink glint. Hollis. He hadn't signed in, hadn't stopped at the desk. He'd used a key, one he hadn't admitted having. He wasn't a man paying a visit. He was a man covering his footprints with choreography. I returned to the brownstone and laid the printouts in front of Wolfe like evidence at an inquisition. "He was there," I said, "before she died, lied about it." Wolfe studied the timestamps, then nodded. A lie from a lawyer is rarely news, but the door, the method, those are choices. Intent is the compass of guilt. I knew that tone, quiet and judicial. It meant Wolfe had just added a name to his mental diagram and tightened the string by half an inch. Kramer arrived with his usual subtlety, a doorbell that rang like a challenge and a face that looked freshly chiseled from contempt. He didn't wait for an invitation. Wolfe didn't offer one. "Preliminary talks," Kramer said, dropping a folded page on the desk. "Trace chloral hydrate in the system. Our dancer didn't go out wide awake." I picked it up. "Knockout drops?" "Just enough to make her docile, not enough to kill." "Unless," Wolfe murmured, "the killing was meant to look like something else." Kramer snorted. "Don't get fancy. We've got Hollis on tape. We'll squeeze him." Wolfe leaned back. "You will squeeze a man trained to make pressure look like perfume?" Kramer eyed him. "You taking this on, Wolfe?" "I have accepted a fee," Wolfe replied without inflection. "That figures." As Kramer left, I watched Wolfe's fingers drum once, only once, on the armrest. That was his version of pacing. The chloral hydrate meant planning. Planning meant intention. And intention, in Wolfe's world, was a crime waiting for its sentence. Some men sketch. Wolfe doesn't. He diagrammed with words, spoken, muttered, sometimes rearranged mid-thought. It was like watching logic take shape without ever touching a pencil. He dictated a list, names, times, claims, contradictions. I wrote fast and said little. Janelle called Dain at 10:30, hysterical, mentioned Switzerland. The line went dead, approximately time of death, 11:10, meaning she died 40 minutes after the call. Approximately, but consider Hollis arrived at 9:42. Why would she call Dain at 10:30 unless Hollis had already left? Or unless someone else had arrived? Wolfe nodded. Precisely. He began drawing the connections aloud. Janelle had something. Documents, perhaps. Something from Zurich. Ebert had funded her lifestyle. Hollis had facilitated travel, but someone else had feared exposure. The sedative, he said, suggests premeditation, not rage. Then who gains? That is what we must deduce. He paused, then instructed me to compile a complete movement log, every name, every known address, time of presence, gaps in alibi. And the doorman, he added, bring me his schedule. When Wolfe starts using people as pieces, it means the game has passed theory. It was only a matter of who would fall first. The bell rang near dusk. I opened the door to a woman in her mid-20s with nerves so loud you could hear them before she spoke. I was Janelle's roommate. For a year I brought her inside. Wolfe inclined his head just enough to signify welcome. I didn't come before because, well, I didn't know what to do, but she gave me this. She handed me an envelope, thick, sealed, folded twice. She said, only if something goes wrong. Wolfe took it, broke the seal with a deliberate motion, and read in silence. His eyes narrowed at one line. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. The room had already shifted. It was the kind of envelope people leave behind when they suspect they'll be leaving in a less organized fashion. No address, no date, just, in case anything happens, written in Janelle Varney's slanted, deliberate hand. Inside, 2 folded pages. No signature, but no doubt whose voice was pressing against the paper. If he ever finds out, it won't matter what I meant. I didn't ask for this. The money isn't worth it. Not anymore. That was the chorus. Vague as a dream you're glad to forget, but not without harmony. Guilt, fear, regret in the past tense. There was no mention of names, only references. The man in the mirror who isn't me, and the files I wasn't supposed to keep. There was something theatrical about the phrasing, but I'd spent enough time with performers to know the most sincere people often speak in riddles when the truth gets too sharp. Wolfe read it without comment. He didn't ask for my opinion, which meant he already had one. He closed the letter gently, like it had weight. We are moving closer, he said. Not forward, but inward. Toward the Colonel. And I knew from the tone it wasn't going to be something you found in daylight. Wolfe never leaves the brownstone, but when the scent of money crosses borders, he travels via paper, and faster than most planes. While I was still cataloguing the implications of Janelle's posthumous prose, Wolfe had me retrieving financial statements, donation disclosures, and quarterly filings from Ebert Consolidated. I knew better than to ask how he had access to them. Wolfe never stooped to burglary. He simply arranged for omissions in other men's scruples. The highlight came disguised as a footnote in the third quarter's audit summary, a $75,000 consulting fee wired to an entity named Belveron AG, headquartered in Zurich. No service provided, no invoice filed, no line-item explanation. Consulting, Wolfe said with the same tone he uses for canned tomatoes. Mr. Ebert has paid for silence, and not his own. Shell company? I asked. Naturally, Wolfe replied. No office, no employees, no identity beyond the account itself. An instrument, not a business. And the recipient? He tapped the letter. Our courier of guilt, truth, and memory. I watched his eyes, not blinking, but blinking in thought. He was mapping motives with precision, the way a botanist diagrams root systems, down to the last unseen tendril. And he had just found where one led. If you've never tried to charm a minor official at the Swiss consulate into violating international confidentiality laws before lunch, let me save you the trouble. It takes finesse, patience, and a willingness to speak bad French with worse conviction. I started with the name Janelle Varney. That got me nowhere. I tried American citizen cultural exchange, which got me a shrug. Then I said private matter related to international inheritance, and offered the kind of smile that doesn't ask permission, but suggests you'll be back with paperwork and an attitude. The junior attaché, mid-30s, nervous ears, collar too stiff, finally gave me something under his breath behind a half-closed file drawer. Vera Lang, entered Zurich via KLM, 2 weeks, no declared employer. I raised an eyebrow, which in diplomatic circles is basically a full confession. Did she meet anyone? He straightened. Sir, I have already told you more than I should. Fair enough, I said. Then let me guess. She wasn't sightseeing. He didn't answer, which in consular terms meant I was warm. I thanked him and left with my conscience still mostly intact. Back at the brownstone, I reported the alias. Wolfe sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. An alias implies fear, he said. And fear, once formalized, becomes strategy. There's a particular tone some lawyers use when you show them a truth they've already stepped around. Peter Hollis used it liberally when I walked back into his office with a smile and a name. Vera Lang, I said. His face didn't fall, but it leaned. That's not my business anymore, he said. You helped her create it, I replied. Forged documents, clean travel identity. Zurich. He lifted one hand, a theatrical gesture of surrender. She was scared. She said it was a mistake, but she didn't want to run. Just hide. From whom? He hesitated. Not the pause of invention, of decision. She never told me, just that someone was watching. And you helped because? He gave me a long, tired look. Because I owed her, and because I'm a fool. I didn't argue. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe absorbed the report like steam through linen. We are now in possession of a motive, he said, not for travel, for elimination. He turned back to his notebook, and I recognized the subtle shift. The line between possible and likely had just moved, which meant someone else was about to lose their footing. Raymond Ebert returned to the brownstone not by invitation, but by inevitability. Wolfe hadn't summoned him. He'd simply waited, which is sometimes more effective. Guilt doesn't need a doorbell, it lets itself in. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped like prayer in litigation. Wolfe, without looking up, said, Zurich is not an errand destination for a nightclub dancer, Mr. Ebert, nor is Belveron AG a charity. Ebert swallowed. I did send her. Wolfe's eyes remained on the page. Why? It was a private arrangement. Wolfe looked up. There are no private arrangements involving shell accounts, fabricated identities, and 2-week stays in financial capitals. Try again. Ebert hesitated. When he spoke, it was with the reluctant rhythm of a man peeling off a bandage he had once mistaken for skin. Something unfortunate from the war. A decision, business, not personal. It came back. She went to clean it up? Yes. What was she cleaning? He didn't answer. He just looked at his hands, as though they still held the paper trail he'd tried to destroy. Wolfe leaned back. A coward's confession is a tautology. You've offered neither fact nor defense. Ebert didn't object, which was, in its own way, the clearest admission we were going to get. It was mid-morning, and Wolfe had just begun mapping a fresh diagram on yellow foolscap, names in columns, lines of intent, the sort of intellectual cartography that replaced movement in his world when the telephone rang. I picked it up. It was Lon Cohen, which meant the information was fresh and waiting for ink. Peter Hollis, he said. East River, face up, throat slit clean. Time? I asked. Early hours, not dumped long before he was found. I thanked him and relayed the facts. Wolfe didn't stop writing. Hollis, I said. Dead, not subtle. No, Wolfe said quietly. Not accidental and not convenient. Whoever eliminated him sought certainty, not distance. You think it's a cleanup? I think it's orchestration. Silence is rarely spontaneous when it follows contradiction. The cut, Lon had said, was neat. That kind of neat didn't happen in a struggle. It happened when someone already had the upper hand. Hollis had lied to me once, dodged twice, and played the fool expertly. Now he was beyond correction, and beyond answers. Wolfe made a single mark on the paper, a name, then, with finality, crossed it out. Inspector Kramer arrived with breath still visible in the morning chill, and a tone warmed by satisfaction. He didn't sit. Hollis killed the girl, he said. Guilt, leverage, whatever. Someone found out, shut him up, case wraps neat. Wolfe, seated at his desk, did not respond. He traced his finger along the diagram as though the name Hollis had never belonged there. Kramer frowned. "You've got a better story?" "No," Wolfe said. "You have a story. I am considering the plot." Kramer shifted. "Evidence says it's him. Circumstance suggests otherwise. Circumstance can't testify. Nor can the dead," Wolfe said. Kramer scowled and left with a parting glare, unsatisfied with Wolfe's silence, but knowing better than to force a reply from a man who turned conversation into chess. After the door closed, I asked, "You buying it?" Wolfe didn't move. He looked at the ceiling as if the truth had been written there in faint chalk, waiting for the right light to read it. "No," he said finally. That was not the ending, only a footnote. And I knew from the way his voice had thinned, he had just revised the entire structure. Wolfe rarely diagrams his deductions aloud unless he's arranging an audience. But that morning, with Fritz clearing breakfast and the orchids safely misted, he indulged in what could almost be called exposition. "3 men," he said, orbiting a woman who knew too much. He raised one finger. "Raymond Ebert, war profiteer in corporate silk. She had leverage, documents no doubt." He paid for her silence. A second finger. "Peter Hollis, legal tactician, our intermediary. He helped her vanish into Zurich, a facilitator, not an initiator." And finally, the third. "Unknown, the eliminator. The one who saw leverage as liability and determined the final debt should be collected in blood." He looked at me. "Find that third." I nodded, though I already knew that meant crawling through hotel records, consulate slips, and other people's bad habits. "What if it's not a man?" I asked. Wolfe made a non-committal noise, which in his vocabulary means possible, but prove it. And so the triangle stood, 1 point dead, 1 unraveling, 1 yet to be named. But Wolfe had drawn it, and once Wolfe draws a triangle, someone usually ends up pinned at its center. I started with the Marston's guest logs, page after page of room assignments, signatures, and initials that looked more like stutters than names. Most of it was routine, businessmen on per diem, couples looking for discretion, a senator who hadn't bothered with an alias. Then I found it. Harold Nixon. Checked in 2 days before Janelle was found dead. No phone number, no forwarding address, paid in cash, a room 2 floors down from hers, gone by morning. The clerk remembered nothing, of course. A man in a tan coat, or was it blue? Might have had glasses, or not. It didn't matter, the name wasn't real, and the ID number written beside it had a digit sequence that matched a South Jersey bus pass issued to a 70-year-old woman. I brought it back to Wolfe. He read it once, then folded the page precisely. "Mr. Nixon," he said, "is a fabrication. But behind fabrications there are always hands." That was my cue. It meant someone's disguise was about to be peeled. And if Wolfe was right, it would be someone we hadn't yet seen, but who'd seen everything. I made some quiet calls, not the kind you make over lunch, the kind where no one gives names and everyone pretends to have forgotten you when it's over. Harold Nixon, as it turned out, was one of the many hats worn by a man named Leonard Ciccarelli, who, in turn, had recently been traveling in the company of alias Vargo. If you don't know Vargo, congratulations. You've led a law-abiding life and never asked the wrong person the right question. He's the sort who wears suits from Naples and speaks in third-party hypotheticals. His money's in offshore accounts, his loyalty's in question, and his temper has a paper trail measured in obituaries. Ciccarelli, alias Nixon, was his errand boy, a detail man, the kind you send when things need to stay unsaid and undone. I didn't tell Wolfe all of that. I didn't have to. He said simply, "Vargo," well, that was all. But the way he said it made the orchids stiffen and the room go colder by 1 philosophical degree. You can tell how Wolfe feels about a person by how he compares them to food. It's not that he does it often, only when disgust requires metaphor. When I said the name Elias Vargo, Wolfe closed his eyes like a man enduring a second-rate soufflé. Then he said, "Bad wine in a crystal glass," which was his way of saying Vargo had style and no character, and that the Polish only made the rot more insulting. He traffics not in crime, Wolfe continued, but in culpability. He purchases what others fear will surface. And Janelle? She must have approached him. Perhaps she was naive enough to think a man like Vargo would pay for discretion the way others pay for loyalty. I shrugged. She picked the wrong buyer. No, Wolfe said quietly. She picked a shark. He merely declined to bite. That he let her live at all disturbs me more. That was the first sign of something new. Wolfe wasn't just disgusted, he was intrigued. And when Wolfe is intrigued by a man he despises, the next course is usually bitter. The rumour came in from one of my quieter channels, a coat-check girl with better ears than most detectives I know. Janelle had once tried to sell something, not favours, not companionship, information, to alias Vargo. She didn't get far. According to the girl, Vargo had laughed, said something about dancers with paper trails and told her to take her stories elsewhere. Most people don't get 2 meetings with Vargo, they get a judgment. That she walked away at all meant one of 2 things. She had nothing he wanted, or she had too much, and he wasn't ready to play. Wolfe listened, eyes closed, hands steepled. She gambled poorly, he said. She thought secrets could be traded like diamonds, but diamonds are owned, secrets are leased. I couldn't argue. She'd tried to negotiate with a man who didn't make deals, only removals. Why didn't he kill her? I asked. Wolfe's eyelids fluttered open, slow as a curtain. Because he didn't need to, he said. Someone else was already watching her. And Vargo doesn't compete. It was a Wednesday, grey and forgettable. I'd tracked Ciccarelli, Vargo's fixer, alias Nixon, to a warehouse in Red Hook. Not the kind that ships anything you can claim on customs, but the kind where trucks idle too long and no one asks why the windows are frosted from the inside. I didn't get cute, I just followed, quiet and casual. He went in. I waited 10 minutes, then knocked, thinking I'd try my luck as a delivery man, maybe bluff my way into an answer or 2. Wrong gamble. The door opened, and I was yanked in by arms that had been waiting. No questions, just a grunt and a left hook that would have made Joe Louis nod in appreciation. I hit the floor, got a boot to the ribs, and then a few minutes of silence, except for my breath, which had turned into a negotiation. They didn't ask who I was, they didn't care. It wasn't torture. That would have required intent. This was punctuation. I came to with the scent of bleach, the taste of copper, and the slow recognition that my own dignity was sitting somewhere near my left shoe. But I was alive, which, considering Vargo's habits, counted as a win. When the uniformed officer hauled me out of the back room, he said, "Anonymous tip," said there was a trespasser. I nodded, bleeding politely. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't even look up from the index card he was writing on with the care of a man etching into stone. When I sat, slowly, and described the warm hospitality I'd received from Vargo's lieutenants, he said only, "I warned you." "Yes, sir." "You did not listen?" "No, sir." "You were fortunate?" I nodded. No argument. Then he stopped writing and finally looked at me. His eyes didn't show concern. They showed irritation. Because I had done what he would not, stepped into the mess, and come back with nothing but bruises. "You have confirmed what I already knew," he said. "Which is always tedious." I opened my mouth, then closed it. There wasn't much to add. Wolfe turned back to his notes. "Now," he said, "let us see who dies next." The call came after dinner. Wolfe was halfway through a second helping of squab à la Nivernais, and Fritz's expression suggested interruption was sacrilege, but I took it, and when I hung up, Wolfe didn't have to ask. "Ebert," I said. "Dead. Office. Found by his secretary. Slumped over his desk. Poison." Wolfe put his fork down, not dropped, not flinched, just placed. "What kind?" he asked. "Preliminary says alkaloid, something clean, dissolves well, no smell, classic." He closed his eyes. "A man pays for silence," he murmured, "then dies in it." I nodded. So now the triangle's broken? No, Wolfe said. Now the center has collapsed. I didn't understand, not then, but Wolfe wasn't interested in symmetry anymore. He was interested in the pressure that builds when silence becomes unbearable and when people forget that secrets, like poisons, need only a drop. He looked up at me. Now, he said, we work without illusions. If I thought Wolfe might let Ebert's expiration slip gently into the unpaid ledger category and resume his war on calories rather than crime, I misjudged him by a yard and a half. He was our client, I offered, testing the waters. He was a cipher, Wolfe retorted, and a dead cipher offers no further utility, but an insult does. That was Wolfe's version of rolling up his sleeves, philosophically. What insult? An assault on reason, he said. 3 deaths, 1 narrative, no elegance. He spoke it like the closing line of a ruined sonnet. So instead of dismissing the case with a grumble and a glower, he leaned into it. Not for money, we were unlikely to see a red cent from Ebert's estate, but for revenge, not personal, intellectual. The man had been killed with poison, quiet, efficient, undramatic, and Wolfe hates a tidy ending without an adequate architecture beneath it. I refilled his beer just to keep the world balanced and waited for the next command. It came. Invite them. Sending invites for a Wolfe soiree has all the warmth of serving subpoenas on Christmas Eve, but I did it with my usual charm. Alias Vargo got a terse note delivered through a man who looked allergic to neckties. Mickey Julian was coaxed in person. He sweated before I even mentioned Wolfe. The hotel manager, Mr. Lynn Cavendish, responded with the kind of promptness only guilt or fear inspires. And Janelle's ex-roommate, Miss Greer, arrived by phone with a breathless, "Should I bring the letter?" I didn't answer that. I just gave her the time and address. Wolfe didn't believe in preambles, musical interludes, or tea sandwiches. He believed in pressure and the strange things it made people say. By late afternoon, we had a full house scheduled, minus the dead and the disappeared. And by the curve in Wolfe's mouth, not quite a smile, I knew he was hoping the architecture of lies might finally creak under the weight of too many guests. The office had its usual gravity when it was full of suspects, but this crowd added a different flavor, like someone had stirred gunpowder into Wolfe's morning eggs. Vargo reclined with a smirk that looked custom-stitched. Julian sat forward, like the chair had turned into a rack. Cavendish folded his hands so tightly his knuckles went white. Miss Greer kept adjusting her coat as if it might make her smaller. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally. Instead, he spoke with the ease of a man addressing insects beneath a microscope. "Miss Varney," he began, "possessed leverage on several of you. She is dead. Mr. Hollis, who moved among you with deceptive skill, is also dead. Mr. Ebert, who paid to keep shadows buried, is likewise expired." No one spoke. Even the air declined to move. Wolfe's eyes, half-lidded, turned toward Cavendish. "You, sir, controlled the Marston's keys. Every locked room she occupied, every breach, stemmed from your registry." Cavendish opened his mouth. Wolfe cut him off with a glance. "I will speak," Wolfe said, "and you will hear something truer than your rehearsed reply." And that was only the overture. "You will indulge a brief geography lesson," Wolfe said, folding his hands as though addressing a tribunal rather than a roomful of suspects. "Switzerland is not merely scenic, it is accommodating, especially to men who require their sins to be bankable." He paused. No one objected. Miss Varney travelled there under false papers. The identity was constructed by Peter Hollis. The funds were provided by Raymond Ebert. The reason was a bundle of wartime records, authentic, damning, and preserved by a secretary who listened too well and burned nothing. His gaze floated across the room, not quite fixing on anyone. That made it worse. She intended to trade them, to expose them perhaps. What matters is that she returned with a target stitched between her shoulder blades. Miss Greer blinked rapidly. Cavendish coughed. "Men died during the war. Some deserved it, some didn't. But legacies," Wolfe continued, "are fragile, and some will kill to keep theirs untouched by ink. I watched Vargo closely, but if Wolfe's theory struck a chord, it was buried beneath the operatic calm of his expression. "Now," Wolfe said, "let us consider motive." Hollis, Wolfe intoned, was not simply the courier. He attempted to become the broker. This got Dain to frown, which might have been progress. Vargo showed teeth again, the way predators do when they're bored with sheep. Wolfe elaborated. Miss Varney entrusted him with the documents, but not the decision. He approached Mr. Vargo, likely through intermediaries, and made an offer, perhaps for money, perhaps for safety, but Janelle refused to relinquish control. He shifted in his chair, only slightly, which was tantamount to pacing the room in Wolfe terms. She was not naive, he said, but she believed in boundaries. Hollis did not. And when the transaction failed, someone decided the documents would change hands without permission. Vargo's silence was perfectly executed, neither defensive nor dismissive. Hollis died shortly after, Wolfe said, which proves he was still holding something valuable. Then quietly, a man does not die for delivering nothing. The question of how, Wolfe said, is as central as why. He reached for the stack of notes I'd handed him an hour earlier, room logs, staff schedules, duplicates of master key assignments, and plucked one free like a sommelier, selecting a vintage. Miss Varney was murdered in a locked hotel suite. Mr. Hollis entered the Marston unseen via service hallway and died far from any room he'd checked into. Mr. Ebert expired in his home, a place with no known breach, yet signs of tampering. Wolfe tapped the paper. All three sites share one thread, the Marston Hotel, and the only consistent access lies with the night master key, kept, officially, by the hotel manager. Cavendish stiffened. I watched him start to speak. Wolfe beat him to it. But unofficially, he said, voice still velvet, it may have found its way into other hands. For instance, a brother's, one who once worked under Ebert's payroll. The effect was immediate. Cavendish's face didn't change, but his breath did. It vanished. Your brother, Wolfe said, not looking up from his notes, was named Everett Cavendish. Cavendish's lips moved before any sound came out. Was. Yes, past tense. He died in 1945, in a factory fire in Ghent that landed like a falling chandelier. I don't, Cavendish stammered. You do, Wolfe said softly. You knew, you always knew. Ebert ran that factory, a shell company for materials routed where they shouldn't be. Your brother was caught in something larger than himself. I glanced at Vargo, who showed the mild curiosity of a man watching others play chess badly. Miss Varney learned of it, either through Ebert or her own digging. She may have even uncovered your link. Cavendish's hands were on his knees now, not clenched, just flat. She didn't go to the police, Wolfe said. She wrote a letter, gave it to someone, perhaps Miss Greer, or perhaps she trusted time to keep its mouth shut. Wolfe sighed. But time failed, and your brother died twice, once in Ghent and once again here, through your silence. We were halfway through Wolfe's quiet lecture on memory and motive when the telephone rang. Fritz answered it, his voice a model of Teutonic calm, until it wasn't. I caught the shift in his tone and crossed to him. He handed me the receiver. It was the fire department. The Marston Hotel was on fire, not a kitchen mishap, not an overheated laundry chute, number arson, accelerants, locked stairwells, desperation with a matchbook. I turned to Wolfe, who was still in his chair but no longer composed. He did not speak. Instead, his fingers tightened around the edge of the chair's arm as if he could squeeze the truth out of it. The hotel, I said, is burning. He nodded once, then murmured, when men set fire to the past, it is never to stay warm. It is to erase. Outside, the guests stirred. Inside, Wolfe leaned back, as if the flames were now part of the equation he meant to solve. If there's a man in Manhattan who can derive 20 truths from a sentence that begins with preliminary report, it's Nero Wolfe. He reclined, no, entrenched, in his chair, the fire marshal's findings fanned in one hand, lips pressing a small pout of contempt. "Room 408, he muttered. "An ignoble fate for a noble purpose." The Marston fire, for all its blaze and smoke, hadn't fooled the experts. Accelerant, concentrated at floor level. Entry signs tampered. But what had Wolfe humming, almost inaudibly, was the line buried 3/4 in primary ignition in southeast quadrant, closet wall compromised post-flame. Someone, it seemed, wanted that room not merely gone, but sterilized, like a petri dish holding a contagion of truth. Wolfe didn't name names, not yet. But the pages fluttering in his hand weren't just char, they were motive reduced to soot. "The irony," he said at last, "is that the room remembered what its occupants tried to forget." I jotted that down out of habit, even though it sounded more like elegy than deduction. His eyes lifted, distant but sharp. "Archie, go and see what the fire spared. Not all conflagrations succeed." The Marston still stank of ruin, wet ash, blistered varnish, and the special kind of silence that follows professional cleaning crews and professional sins. Room 408 was cordoned, but my badge and smirk got me past the tape. The closet in question, blackened and split like a mouth that had tried to scream, held its secrets grudgingly. I ran my fingers along the interior, and the third panel in gave a hollow knock. Behind a scorched veneer, something metal resisted my polite nudging. 5 minutes, a penknife, and one muttered oath later, the lockbox emerged, charred at the edges, scorched but smug in its survival. The thing had been wedged into the bones of the wall, not meant for retrieval by accident or curiosity. Back at the car, I weighed it in my lap. Whatever it held had outlived a fire, a cover-up, and the girl who'd once feared both. That kind of stubbornness didn't come cheap. By the time I crossed the threshold of the brownstone and handed it over, Wolfe was already shifting orchids like bishops in a slow chess game. He took the box without comment, but I caught the flick of his eyebrow. It wasn't triumph, it was confirmation. The interior of the box was lined with regret. That's not metaphor. I mean, the kind of regret written in blue-black ink by a hand too steady for innocence. Janelle had a tidy script, almost schoolmarmish, and it catalogued sins that made the blood slow down, textile shipments, dates, code names for routes and factories. But then came the grim curveball, locations cross-referenced with Eastern European camps that history now shelves under atrocity. Hungary, 1944. Ebert's name was there, not once, not casually, but methodically. His overseas compliance department, his supply chain optimization, she had it all, and she kept it, not for memory's sake, but for leverage. I didn't ask Wolfe if it was enough. He didn't ask me how it felt to hold a corpse's confession. We understood. He turned a page, then another, eyes narrowing slightly at a margin note. "Zurich, safe?" asked Peter. He grunted. "Mr. Goodwin, we now proceed to choreography." That was Wolfe speak for assembling a murder in reverse. Janelle, Wolfe said, had neither loyalty nor malice, only fear and a talent for noticing what frightened others. He was seated, of course, in the yellow chair that had known more strategy than any war room. The ledgers were open like confessionals across his desk. "She uncovered the documents," he continued. "Not by accident. Mr. Ebert paid her to manage his private accounts, including a Swiss node with more secrecy than solvency. She found the wartime records, perhaps first in name, then in meaning. I nodded because his tone required it. She confronted Ebert, not with accusation but implication. The money followed, enough to buy her silence and fund her Zurich excursion. She travelled as Vera Lang. That detail, Mr. Goodwin, was your contribution. I do not forget." My contribution nodded back. "Peter Hollis," Wolfe went on, "thought he could monetize the material, broker it, either to blackmail Vargo or threaten Ebert's remaining allies. Janelle refused. Whether it was principle or control, she denied the transfer, and that sealed her fate." "And Hollis's?" I asked. Wolfe didn't answer. His eyes were closed, as if watching the next step in an invisible waltz. "Bertram," he said, "was the stopgap. The hand that turned private terror into public silence, And for him, Mr. Goodwin, the motive was not money. It was subtle at first, like most of Wolfe's turns, the offhand mention, the pivot, then the sting. Bertram, he mused, has been present in every frame of this grotesque tableau, present and unnoticed, a clerk in his own play. That wasn't quite fair, but it wasn't false either. Bertram, the Marston's unflappable manager, had the kind of face you forgot even while looking at it. But Wolfe had remembered something most had filed under eccentricity. The umbrella, always with him, whether sun, rain, or snowflake rumour. That umbrella, Wolfe said, was never absent, even on nights clear as polished glass. One might say he used it as a prop, or perhaps, he paused delicately, a keychain. That was the trick. Bertram held a master key to the Marston, officially for emergencies, unofficially for anything he wished to classify as such. He accessed 408, Wolfe said. He watched Janelle, he watched Hollis, he waited, and when it was time to erase, he opened the door with a nod and walked through unnoticed. We didn't have the verdict yet, but we had the man. Kramer arrived like a hailstorm with a cigar. His trench coat dripped rain and hostility in equal measure. He took one look at Wolfe and snorted, "I'm not here for poetry." Wolfe gave a lazy wave toward the ledger. "Then read prose, Inspector. It's damning enough." To his credit, Kramer read fast. His brows did the usual dance, lift, scowl, flatten. Then his eyes settled on the last few pages. I watched his lips move as he traced Janelle's notes. "That's motive," he admitted. "Maybe." "Motive is easy," Wolfe replied. "Opportunity is narrower. The Marston's master key, Bertram's key, unlocked all three victims' rooms. His umbrella bore a hollowed handle. Within it, a fine steel blade, unregistered, unremarkable, until its recent use." Kramer grunted again, the kind that signalled reluctant respect. Wolfe pressed the point. "Bertram's brother," he said softly, "died in a Hungarian textile camp, employed by Ebert, then discarded. Your man watched the deaths pile up in a ledger long before Janelle started hers. When Bertram entered, called in by Wolfe, he didn't protest. He wept, not theatrically, just quietly, like someone watching the dam he built crack under weight he couldn't name. I didn't want to kill her, he said, only stop the past. The silence after Bertram's departure hung thick. Kramer lingered, half expecting Wolfe to crow or philosophize, but the man who delighted in linguistic peacocking said nothing for nearly a minute. Then, in a voice low and toneless, Wolfe offered his verdict, not to me, not even to Kramer, but to the room. Some crimes, Mr. Kramer, he said, are not buried. They are bound, in ink, in silence, in ledgers written by ghosts who refuse to rest. Kramer made a sound that might have been agreement or disgust. He left without shaking hands. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at nothing. Then finally, the orchids. When he spoke again, it was to them. It is an unsatisfactory resolution, he murmured, but it will have to suffice. Conscience seldom pays its debt in full. And with that, the case was closed, but the ledgers stayed open. At 6:45, Fritz came to the office door with his usual announcement that dinner was approaching its moment of readiness. That meant I had about 4 minutes to persuade Wolfe to rise from his chair and commit himself to table and silver. But Wolfe didn't budge. No, he said, just that, clipped and flat with no garnish. I raised a brow. You skipping a meal, or has the apocalypse moved to Manhattan? He closed his eyes, then opened them again, like the gesture had cost him. There is a stench in this house, Archie. Not of decay, but of morality compromised. It must be aired. Symbolically, or shall I open a window? Fritz, Wolfe called, ignoring me, you will prepare consommé. Only consommé, with Madeira. I will dine when the atmosphere has been purified. It wasn't the strangest order Wolfe had ever given under the influence of righteousness, but it ranked. Fritz, to his credit, said only bien sûr, and returned to the kitchen like an old priest sent to burn incense. I stayed with Wolfe a while longer, neither of us speaking. In the brownstone that night, Silence wasn't absence, it was ritual. I sat in the front room with a bourbon and the file on my lap, flipping through papers like they were postcards from a place I'd never get to see again. Janelle's photo, third page from the top, caught a sliver of amber light from the street lamp outside. She was leaning on a rail, eyes closed, lips parted, somewhere between a sigh and a secret. It had been taken years ago, long before room 408, long before ledgers and Zurich and blood disguised as ink. She hadn't been a femme fatale, no mink, no smoke ring, no deliberate glances. She danced because she knew how to carry silence in motion. A girl like that doesn't invite men, she haunts them. The men in her orbit, Ebert, Hollis, Bertram, had all tried to pull her into their logic. She'd slipped through them like silk they couldn't grip. She didn't just carry secrets, she bore the weight of what others buried. And maybe that's why she ended up alone. Not unloved, just unclaimed. Julian's absence was not the operatic sort. No suicide note on hotel stationery, no confession telegram. He didn't vanish in shame or in glory. He simply left. There was a rumor passed to me through one of Fritz's butcher connections, don't ask, that Mickey Dulain had caught a flight to Zurich under a different name and a borrowed passport. Another said he'd been seen boarding a freighter from Hoboken, a piano tuner's case in tow. But in a world where silence is a commodity, I knew what his vanishing act meant. He'd chosen disappearance over performance. He hadn't killed, at least not with his hands, but he had known. And knowing, for someone like Mickey, was as corrosive as guilt. Wolfe remarked once that Dulain was an echo without a source. I didn't argue. Some men finish their concert in darkness, and the applause never comes. The bottle arrived in a box with no note, but enough gravitas to choke a diplomat. Hungarian Takagi, 1935, dark gold and expensive. I brought it in like it might bite. Wolfe stared at the label, made a soft noise in the back of his throat, and said one word. Vargo. He didn't have to explain. Alias Vargo didn't send thank you notes or threats. He sent ambiguity, dressed in etiquette. Quite the vintage, I said, setting it on his desk. An insult, not a compliment, Wolfe replied. Guilt preserved in glass. He picked it up, turned it slowly, then handed it to me with a grimace as if the thing had developed a pulse. To the kitchen. Drain it. The sink has fewer illusions. I obeyed. There are things you don't question, and Wolfe's instinct about symbolic decay is one of them. I watched the wine swirl into the basin like a funeral for taste. When I returned, Wolfe had resumed his chair and closed his eyes, not in rest, but in refusal. Archie, he murmured, decency and diplomacy are rarely bedfellows. Sometimes one must be poured away. Kramer showed up with a cigar he didn't smoke and a scowl he didn't sharpen. That was my first hint. He stood in the hallway like a man visiting a doctor he didn't believe in. Fritz ushered him in and vanished. Wolfe didn't stand, of course. I came to say, Kramer began, then stopped, then tried again. This one was dirty, Wolfe. You scrubbed it. Doesn't mean I like how you did it. Wolfe gave a barely perceptible nod, like a monarch acknowledging a knight whose sword hadn't quite hit the mark. I accept your gratitude, Inspector, sparingly rendered but genuine. Kramer sat. Wolfe didn't offer beer or chair talk, just a small statement. Justice, he said, is not a thing done, but a thing accepted. Kramer grunted. Tell that to the dead. He didn't stay long, left his cigar behind, untouched. That was the second hint. I didn't mention it, but I watched Wolfe pick it up later and drop it neatly in the trash. That was the third. The orchids were unusually still, as if listening. Wolfe stood among them with the reverence of a man in a chapel, one hand lightly stroking a phalaenopsis bloom, the other tucked behind his back. I leaned against the doorframe, not speaking. I've learned that when Wolfe gets poetic, it's best not to interrupt until he's tipped his glass of metaphor completely. She wore silk, he said softly. But it did not wear her. It carried her. "Janelle?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved 2 pots an inch apart and adjusted a brass misting valve. "There are women," he said, "who wear silk as adornment, and women who leave blood in its folds." I didn't ask which kind Janelle had been. "She did not choose vengeance," he continued, "but she allowed its presence. That is a subtler guilt, one the law cannot touch and conscience seldom punishes." I wanted to ask something sharp, maybe whether we'd done right, maybe whether truth had finally settled. But the air in the plant rooms didn't welcome clutter. So I stayed quiet, and Wolfe kept tending to things that bloomed in silence. Later, after Fritz had cleared away the consommé and the orchids had gone back to their private rituals, I found myself sitting in the office, alone with the file. Wolfe had gone up early, not from fatigue, but from completion. I flipped through Janelle's dossier again, photographs, contracts, inked margins, one pressed flower. And suddenly, I wasn't thinking about who killed whom. I was thinking about the room 408. It hadn't been hers by lease, or love, or comfort, but it had held her long enough to echo. And me? I still wonder why a girl like Janelle chose to dance alone in a room no one ever visited twice. Maybe she knew something we didn't. Maybe that was the point. In the end, justice didn't arrive with handcuffs or headlines. It slipped in quietly, like an apology too long delayed. A room burned, a brother wept, and a dancer's silence echoed louder than her steps ever had. Wolfe, as ever, never moved unless the mind was moved first. And in the folds of old silk and scorched paper, we found not just evidence, but something dangerously close to remorse. Do you believe guilt fades when the guilty fall? Or does it linger in the lives they've touched? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes,